Imagine a time when humans roamed the forests and plains of Europe, hunting wild animals, gathering berries, and living in small, close-knit groups. It was a time before cities, before written language, and even before farming. Now, imagine the moment when everything changed, a moment when humans transitioned from living off the land to reshaping it. This monumental shift didn't just transform the way people lived, it altered their very DNA. The story of Europe's first farmers is a tale of revolution, one that forever changed the genetic and cultural fabric of the continent. These early agriculturalists didn't just plant seeds in the soil, they planted the foundations of modern civilization. But how did this transformation happen? And what does it tell us about the genetic makeup of modern Europeans? Today, we'll explore the fascinating story of how the first farmers arrived in Europe, how they interacted with the indigenous hunter-gatherers, and how their genes became a permanent part of Europe's genetic history. But here's the twist. Recent advances in DNA analysis are giving us new insights into this ancient chapter of history. These genetic clues reveal not just who these early farmers were, but how their migration and lifestyles fundamentally altered human biology. From the foods we eat to the traits we inherit, their legacy lives on in surprising ways. By the end of this journey, you'll have a deeper understanding of how Europe's first farmers reshaped not only their environment, but also the genetic destiny of an entire continent. So, let's dive in. How did Europe's first farmers change genetic history? And what does their legacy mean for us today? Before farming revolutionized Europe, the continent was a vastly different place. Wild, untamed, and sparsely populated. For tens of thousands of years, Europe was home to hunter-gatherer communities who thrived by living off the land. These small, nomadic groups had mastered the art of survival in harsh conditions, relying on an intimate knowledge of their environment to hunt animals, fish, and gather edible plants. But what did life look like for these early Europeans? Imagine a time when vast ice sheets had only recently retreated, leaving behind dense forests, open plains, and rugged terrain. For the hunter-gatherers, every day was a test of adaptability. Their diet was rich in wild game like deer, boar, and fish, supplemented by nuts, berries, and roots. Mobility was key. They followed the seasons, moving to where food was most abundant. Socially, these groups were relatively egalitarian. Resources were shared, and the survival of the group depended on cooperation. There was little room for hierarchy or personal wealth, when everything you owned had to be carried with you. But there were limits to this way of life. Hunter-gatherer populations were small and scattered, often living on the edge of subsistence. The unpredictable nature of their lifestyle, depending on the whims of nature for food, meant they couldn't support large, stable communities. Now, here's where it gets fascinating. Even before the arrival of farming, genetic studies have revealed some surprising insights about these ancient Europeans. DNA from skeletal remains shows that pre-agricultural Europeans had a distinct genetic profile. They belonged to haplogroups like I and U, lineages that we can still trace today in some modern Europeans. These genes tell us about their physical traits and adaptations. For example, they had darker skin compared to modern Europeans, but lighter eyes, particularly blue or green. They were well adapted to their environment, but their genetic toolkit lacked traits we now associate with farming populations, like lactose tolerance and certain immune system advantages. Despite their adaptability, the hunter-gatherer lifestyle had its constraints. The population density remained low, and technological innovations were limited compared to what farming would later bring. This was the Europe that the first farmers would encounter, a continent of resilient, resourceful people living in harmony with nature, but also a place ready for transformation. The stage was set for one of the most profound shifts in human history. But who were these farmers? And how did they bring change to this world of hunter-gatherers? Stay with me as we uncover how farming arrived in Europe and the dramatic impact it had on both the land and its people. Farming arrived in Europe over 9,000 years ago, bringing with it a wave of transformation that forever altered the continent's trajectory. But this revolutionary way of life didn't originate in Europe. It began in a region known as the Fertile Crescent, spanning parts of modern-day Turkey, Iraq, and Syria. Here, humans first mastered the art of agriculture, domesticating plants like wheat and barley, and animals such as sheep, goats, and cattle. This breakthrough allowed them to produce surplus food, paving the way for larger, more stable communities. Over time, the knowledge and practices of these early farmers began to spread outward, eventually reaching Europe around 7000 BCE. The journey of these early farmers into Europe is one of determination and adaptation. Migrating from Anatolia, in modern-day Turkey, they traveled along river valleys and coastlines, using both overland routes and boats to traverse the Mediterranean. As they arrived in southeastern Europe, they brought not just their crops and livestock, but also their tools, techniques, and a fundamentally different way of life. Unlike the hunter-gatherers who lived off the land's natural resources, these farmers actively reshaped the landscape to suit their needs, clearing forests and planting fields. Their innovations were remarkable. They introduced staple crops like wheat and barley, which would form the foundation of European diets for millennia. They brought domesticated animals, replacing the unpredictable practice of hunting with a steady supply of meat, milk, and labor. Pottery became an essential part of daily life, used for storing food and water. Most importantly, these farmers established permanent settlements, villages that became the first roots of the sedentary life we recognize today. This shift wasn't just cultural. It had profound genetic consequences as well. Modern genetic studies have traced the DNA of these early farmers to their origins in Anatolia and the Levant. Their arrival in Europe introduced a distinct genetic signature that had previously been absent on the continent. For instance, they carried haplogroup G2A, a lineage strongly associated with early farming communities. This haplogroup became widespread as farming populations expanded, blending with the genes of Europe's indigenous hunter-gatherers. These early farmers also brought with them genetic traits that would shape the future of European populations, such as lighter skin pigmentation and immune system adaptations that helped them thrive in denser, settled communities. The arrival of farming didn't just change the people, it changed the land itself. Forests were cleared, fields were planted, and the European landscape began to take on the patchwork of farmland we recognize today. It marked the beginning of a profound shift, one where humans moved from adapting to their environment to actively transforming it to fit their needs. But the arrival of farming wasn't a clean replacement of one way of life with another. It was a complex process of interaction between the new farmers and the hunter-gatherers who had called Europe home for millennia. This meeting of worlds wasn't just a clash, it was an exchange. Ideas, technologies, and even genes flowed between these two groups, leaving a legacy that continues to shape modern Europe. To fully understand how this meeting unfolded, we need to explore what happened when the worlds of farmers and hunter-gatherers collided. The arrival of Europe's first farmers didn't mean the immediate disappearance of the continent's original hunter-gatherer populations. Instead, what followed was a complex process of interaction, coexistence, and eventual blending of these two groups. At first, the contrast between their lifestyles was stark. The hunter-gatherers, who had thrived in Europe for tens of thousands of years, lived a mobile existence, relying on hunting, fishing, and foraging. In contrast, the farmers brought with them a settled way of life, building permanent homes and cultivating the land to sustain their communities. These differences didn't mean outright conflict, though. Archaeological evidence suggests that in many cases, farmers and hunter-gatherers coexisted for generations. They traded goods and knowledge, with hunter-gatherers adopting tools and technologies brought by the farmers, while farmers may have benefited from the deep environmental knowledge of their hunter-gatherer neighbors. This exchange wasn't limited to tools or crops. It extended to ideas, cultural practices, and ultimately genes. One of the most significant impacts of this meeting was genetic mixing. Ancient DNA analysis has shown that Europe's early farmers and hunter-gatherers interbred, leaving traces of both groups in the genetic makeup of later populations. At first, this mixing was limited, with farmers maintaining distinct genetic profiles, but over time, interbreeding increased. The result was a new genetic landscape, blending traits from both groups and spreading them across the continent. One of the most fascinating examples of this genetic legacy is the gene for lactose tolerance. Early hunter-gatherers and farmers alike were lactose intolerant, unable to digest milk beyond childhood. However, as dairy farming became an integral part of agricultural life, individuals with a genetic mutation allowing them to process lactose had a significant survival advantage. This trait spread through the population, marking one of the clearest examples of how culture and genetics influenced each other during this period. Sites like Lepenski Vir, located in modern-day Serbia, provide a glimpse into this period of interaction. Archaeological findings reveal a mix of hunter-gatherer and farming practices, as well as evidence of cultural blending. At Lepenski Vir, stone houses and fishing tools coexist with early pottery and domesticated animal remains, suggesting a period where the two groups lived side by side, sharing resources and gradually merging their ways of life. The blending of farmers and hunter-gatherers wasn't uniform across Europe. In some areas, the two groups coexisted for centuries, while in others, farming spread more rapidly, and the genetic signature of hunter-gatherers diminished over time. Still, their influence remained, not only in the DNA of modern Europeans, but in the cultural practices and traditions that would shape the continent for millennia. This period of interaction between farmers and hunter-gatherers laid the foundation for Europe's genetic and cultural diversity. It wasn't just a simple replacement of one group by another. It was a meeting of worlds, where differences became strengths and the seeds of modern Europe were sown. But the story doesn't end here. To truly understand the legacy of Europe's first farmers, we need to explore how their genetic influence continued to evolve in the millennia that followed, reshaping not just Europe's populations, but its societies as well. The genetic impact of Europe's first farmers wasn't limited to their immediate descendants. It laid the groundwork for genetic traits that persist even today. As farming populations spread across Europe, they introduced new genes into the continent's gene pool, reshaping the biological makeup of its inhabitants in ways that would influence health, appearance, and survival for millennia. One of the most noticeable genetic contributions of these early farmers was their influence on skin pigmentation. Pre-farming Europeans, primarily hunter-gatherers, had darker skin, a trait well suited to the forests and less sunlit climates of prehistoric Europe. But the farmers migrating from Anatolia and the Near East carried genetic variants associated with lighter skin, which gradually became more common. This adaptation likely provided an advantage in northern climates, where lighter skin helped synthesize vitamin D in regions with less sunlight. Another significant legacy is the spread of genes related to lactose tolerance. Early farmers relied heavily on domesticated animals, not only for meat, but also for milk. Over time, a genetic mutation that allowed some adults to digest lactose, a sugar found in milk, became more advantageous. This trait, which started as a rarity, spread widely across Europe due to the survival and reproductive success of those who carried it. Today, it remains one of the most well-known examples of genetic adaptation linked to farming. The sedentary lifestyle brought by farming also influenced immune system development. Living in close proximity to domesticated animals and other people in settled communities exposed early farmers to new diseases. Over time, genes that enhanced resistance to infections became more common, a trend visible in the immune system markers of modern Europeans. While this adaptation helped populations survive infectious diseases, it also introduced trade-offs, such as a greater prevalence of autoimmune conditions in today's populations. Despite their profound impact, the genetic legacy of these first farmers wasn't static. Later migrations, including those of the Indo-Europeans from the Eurasian steppes, added new layers to Europe's genetic mosaic. These groups brought their own genetic markers and traits, further blending with the genetic contributions of the earlier farmers and hunter-gatherers. The result is a complex, multi-layered genetic history that still shapes Europe's populations today. Modern DNA studies have allowed scientists to trace these legacies with incredible precision. By analyzing ancient remains, researchers can identify how specific genetic traits spread across time and space, offering a clearer picture of how Europe's first farmers reshaped the continent's gene pool. These findings not only illuminate the past, but also help us understand the biological heritage that connects ancient Europeans to their modern descendants. The influence of Europe's first farmers wasn't limited to their genes. Their cultural practices and societal structures also left an enduring impact. But before we explore how these farmers shaped Europe's societies, are you ready for the next section? The arrival of Europe's first farmers didn't just reshape genetics. It fundamentally transformed societies, marking the dawn of a new way of life that would redefine human civilization. Before farming, European communities were small, mobile, and egalitarian, relying on the shared efforts of hunting and gathering for survival. The introduction of agriculture changed everything, creating the conditions for larger, more stable populations and sparking the rise of new social structures. One of the most significant changes was the shift from a mobile to a sedentary lifestyle. Farming required people to remain in one place to cultivate crops and tend livestock, leading to the establishment of permanent settlements. These settlements, often centered around fertile lands and water sources, grew in size and complexity over time. For the first time, humans began living in larger communities, which required new forms of organization and governance. The transition to farming also introduced the concept of land ownership. Unlike hunter-gatherers, who relied on communal access to resources, farmers needed to control and defend their plots of land. This shift laid the foundation for social hierarchies, as certain individuals or families gained more land and resources than others. Over generations, these hierarchies became entrenched, leading to the emergence of leaders, elites, and structured societies. Religion and spirituality also evolved alongside these societal changes. The sedentary life of farming allowed for the construction of monumental structures, such as megalithic tombs and ceremonial sites, which reflected new forms of collective identity and spiritual practices. Farming communities often worshiped deities associated with fertility, the harvest, and the cycles of nature, underscoring their deep dependence on the land. Dietary habits changed dramatically as well. The shift to farming introduced a diet based on cultivated grains like wheat and barley, which replaced the diverse mix of wild foods consumed by hunter-gatherers. While this new diet supported larger populations, it also had drawbacks. Archaeological evidence shows that early farmers faced increased rates of malnutrition and disease compared to their hunter-gatherer predecessors, likely due to a narrower range of nutrients and the challenges of living in denser, less sanitary settlements. The legacy of these societal transformations can still be seen in the foundations of modern civilization. The concepts of private property, organized religion, and hierarchical governance all trace their roots to the changes brought about by Europe's first farmers. But these changes also came with challenges and debates, questions of inequality, resource management, and environmental impact that remain relevant today. The story of Europe's first farmers is far from a simple tale of progress. It is a story of adaptation, resilience, and the human drive to innovate and survive. But there's still more to uncover. Are you ready to explore the challenges and debates surrounding this transformative period? The transition to farming and the profound changes it brought weren't without complications. The story of Europe's first farmers is filled with challenges, contradictions, and debates that continue to intrigue historians, archaeologists, and geneticists today. While farming revolutionized life on the continent, it also raised questions about how this transformation unfolded and its lasting consequences. One of the most debated issues is the nature of the interaction between Europe's first farmers and its indigenous hunter-gatherers. Was the spread of farming primarily a result of migration, with farmers replacing the original inhabitants? Or was it a slower process of cultural diffusion, where hunter-gatherers adopted farming practices over time? Evidence suggests it was a combination of both, varying by region. In some areas, farmers and hunter-gatherers coexisted and intermingled for centuries, blending their cultures and genes. In others, farming populations appear to have largely displaced the original inhabitants, leaving only traces of hunter-gatherer DNA in the gene pool. Another challenge lies in the limitations of genetic and archaeological evidence. While ancient DNA studies have revolutionized our understanding of this period, they are not without gaps. Many regions and time periods remain underrepresented, leaving room for interpretation and speculation. Similarly, archaeological findings often provide indirect evidence, requiring researchers to piece together fragmented clues to understand how these societies functioned and interacted. The environmental impact of farming also raises important questions. The shift from foraging to agriculture fundamentally altered Europe's landscapes, leading to deforestation, soil depletion, and the beginnings of human-driven environmental change. While farming allowed for population growth and societal development, it also introduced vulnerabilities, such as dependence on specific crops and susceptibility to famine during bad harvests. These early ecological challenges echo many of the environmental concerns we face today, offering a historical perspective on humanity's relationship with the land. There's also a modern dimension to the study of ancient farming. Advances in genetic research have allowed us to trace the movements and adaptations of these early populations, but they've also sparked debates about how this information should be interpreted and used. Some worry that framing ancient genetic studies in terms of migration and ancestry can inadvertently fuel contemporary political and social agendas, such as debates over national identity or territorial claims. As scientists uncover more about the past, they must navigate the ethical implications of their findings, ensuring that the lessons of history are used to promote understanding rather than division. The Neolithic Revolution in Europe was one of the most transformative periods in human history, but it was not without its complexities and challenges. The interplay of migration, adaptation, environmental change, and cultural interaction continues to captivate researchers and challenge our understanding of what it means to be human. As we reflect on the legacy of Europe's first farmers, we are reminded of the resilience and ingenuity that shaped the course of history, and the enduring questions that keep us looking back to the past for answers. The story of Europe's first farmers is one of transformation on a scale that's hard to overstate. It's the story of how a new way of life reshaped not only the genetic makeup of a continent but also its culture, society, and landscapes. From the Fertile Crescent to the forests of prehistoric Europe, these early agriculturalists brought with them more than seeds and tools. They brought the foundations of the modern world. Their legacy can be seen in the DNA of modern Europeans, carrying traces of those first farmers alongside the genes of the hunter-gatherers they encountered and the later migrations that followed. Traits like lactose tolerance, lighter skin pigmentation, and immune system adaptations all trace their roots to the genetic blending that began during this transformative period. But their impact wasn't limited to biology. The shift to farming laid the groundwork for the societal structures we live within today, from settled communities to systems of governance, religion, and trade. Yet, as remarkable as this transformation was, it also reminds us of the complexities of progress. Farming brought stability and growth, but it also introduced inequality, environmental challenges, and vulnerability to famine and disease. These early farmers had to navigate the balance between innovation and sustainability, a challenge that resonates with our world today. The story of Europe's first farmers is, in many ways, a reflection of the human spirit. It's a story of adaptation, resilience, and the relentless drive to shape the world and find a better way to live. As we uncover more about their lives through archaeology, genetics, and history, we not only learn about their world but gain insight into our own. So, the next time you sit down to a meal of bread, cheese, or even a simple bowl of cereal, take a moment to think about the people who made it all possible. The seeds they planted thousands of years ago still grow, not just in the fields but in our genes, our cultures, and our civilizations. The question isn't just how Europe's first farmers changed genetic history. It's how their legacy continues to shape the world we live in today. Thank you for joining this journey into the past. If you enjoyed this exploration, let us know your thoughts. And don't forget to share this story with others who love uncovering the hidden chapters of human history. Until next time, keep digging deeper into the stories that connect us all.